Okay, so this is lecture 8 of an 8-part lecture series on Philo of Alexandria by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. It is November the 12th, 2014. So I want to finish up with Philo's work on creation, which the book of creation, as I said last time, really parses almost line by line Genesis chapter 1 and then goes into Genesis chapter 2. And from this, he is melding a biblical account of creation with the Platonic idea of creation. But in the process, he's not going strictly according to Plato, because he is definitely emphasizing the idea that there is a creator. He's going against the Aristotelian idea of an eternal universe without some kind of process of creation. But he doesn't believe in creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing that doesn't appear. He believes there's a primordial matter, which is Platonic, but is also biblical, as I said last time. But the groups he's really going against are the Epicureans, who by the ancient terms were considered atheists, meaning non-theists, because they really didn't believe, they were accused of not believing in any gods at all. Which in practical purposes they actually didn't, even though they said the gods existed, but the gods had no contact with the universe, were not responsible for it, don't listen to prayer. In other words, for all practical purposes, the gods don't exist. So that's one of his main targets, is the Epicureans. And so we're going to look at the last selection we're going to look at is a comment on a part of Genesis chapter 2, and we don't really need to look at the biblical text because he quotes it. So if you look at page 18, number 129, he is quoting the end of the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis, and he is which in our terms today, the beginning of chapter 2 of Genesis is actually the end of the creation story in chapter 1. And the new creation story begins in the middle of verse 4. So he's quoting verse 4 and sort of blending it right over into the next creation story. So, Sam, do you want to begin? It's number 129 on page 18.
So Moses, summing up his account of the creation of the world, says in a brief style, quote, "This is the book of the creation of the heaven and of the earth, when it took place, in the day on which God made the heaven and the earth, and every green herb before it appeared upon the earth, and all the grass of the field before it sprang up. Does he not," unquote, "does he not here manifestly set before us incorporeal ideas, perceptible only by the intellect, which have been appointed to be as seals of the perfected works, perceptible by the outward senses?"
So he's using what he sees in the text as a way of understanding that what is created first is the world of forms before the physical world, and that the physical world is only created later, the world of the senses, as opposed to the world of the intellect. Remember, the world of the forms cannot be perceived by the human senses, but only through the intellect. So God creates the world of the intellect, the logos, first, which is, and then out of this comes the world of the senses. So the world of the intellect, the logos, is the template, the plan, the forms on which the physical world is based. So he's reading this very Platonic notion into this biblical verse because of the way it's written. In other words, he's saying, excuse me, I lost my page here for a second. He is saying that you can tell from this verse that what comes first is not the physical world. On the day in which God made the heaven and the earth and every green herb before it appeared. In other words, this is the world before the physical world appeared. That's what he's saying. Everybody get that?
What was the world before the physical world?
The world of forms, the template, the plan, rather than the thing itself.
And this is an accurate quote from the Bible?
Yes, it is. It's the beginning of it's verse 4 of Genesis 2. Yeah.
But are the forms tangible?
They're not tangible in the sense of the physical. Remember, we talked about it. It's I used the analogy to a chair. All chairs are physical manifestation of the form chair. We might think of it as a mental concept, that when you think the word chair, a chair has all chairs have certain characteristics, so that they are based on a template of a non-physical concept of chair. Well, according to Plato, these forms for everything in the universe exist above the physical world in a non-corporeal form. And I think that that's the thing we have trouble wrapping our minds around.
Believe it.
But you have to look at it, the best way to put it in a modern context is a mental construct, an abstract, the idea of chair, rather than the thing itself. Now, in the Platonic system, the idea of chair actually exists in a non-corporeal form above the physical universe. All right?
It's in the cloud.
It's above the lunar sphere, because everything that is below the lunar sphere is physical, made out of the 4 physical elements of air, fire, earth, and water. Everything above the lunar sphere is non-corporeal, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. All right? Yes, Steve, you look like you had a question. Okay, everybody got that? Well, it's Platonic ideas, which have had a long history in the Western tradition. And we are so used to a very materialist, and I don't mean that in a consumerist sense, but in a philosophical sense, that what is only what we can actually perceive, that we have trouble wrapping our minds around it. But it's the world of ideas. It's saying that ideas actually have existence as opposed to physical objects.
And they precede physical objects.
They precede the physical object. In Philo's cosmogony, God creates the world of forms, and this is Platonic, and then the physical world. And he's using this chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 4, to prove his case. Read on, Sam. For before the earth was green.
Thank you. For before the earth was green, he says that this same thing, verdure, which is green, I believe, right?
Yeah, exactly. Greenness.
Existed in the nature of things, and before the grass sprung up in the field, there was grass, though it was not visible.
Meaning the grassness. Grass as a form existed. Green as a form existed before the physical grass, before the physical color of green. Go on.
And we must understand in the case of everything else, which is decided on by the external senses, there were elder forms and motions previously existing, according to which the things which were created were fashioned and measured out. For although Moses did not describe everything collectively, but only a part of what existed, he was desirous of
As he was desirous
of brevity, beyond all men that ever wrote. Still, the few things which he has mentioned are examples of the nature of all. For nature perfects none of those which are perceptible to the outward senses without an incorporeal model.
Meaning he didn't mention everything. You know, he tends to do general classes of things rather than, he can't mention everything. But again, and I think here the word nature in the original Greek is probably cosmos, as we're talking. I'm going to look it up. So the point is that Moses in the Torah does not tell us absolutely, doesn't list absolutely everything, but nonetheless, he gives us the general classes, and that's good enough. Yes, Steve. Stephen.
You've dealt with this question, but how does he view the relationship of Moses and God? Which one wrote the Bible?
Well, it's interesting. He always talks about Moses writing the Torah. All right? So you have to understand for the people at that time, Moses is the lawgiver. It doesn't mean that Philo didn't believe that the Torah wasn't divine revelation, but it comes through Moses, and
Moses is not Homer.
Well, he speaks of as if Moses is the shaper, the author of it, and it wouldn't surprise me. And we're not, going into detail into his concept of revelation. That in fact, for him, revelation is a similar thing. That God doesn't actually give the words, but rather the experience of Moses with God, and then Moses writes the physical form of the law, as opposed to the form of the law. That would make sense, wouldn't it? So you could say, in a way that the later rabbinic doctrine did not, that Moses in a certain sense is the author of the Torah, even though it is divine revelation. Ellie, did you have a question? Anybody have a question? Okay.
How about editor?
I think it's more than that. I think that's a good question. I think, what is Moses' role in actually shaping the words of God is an interesting point, which we're not going to look into that, but there, it's possible to see what he actually thinks about that. Anyway, let me I'll quote you one little thing here about it. Remember, for him, don't forget the Torah is the same as Chokhmah, wisdom, which is the same as Sophia, and which means it, and don't forget, it represents the outward sort of garment of the inward allegorical meaning. Moses, therefore, was the original philosopher. That philosophy originally started with Moses. It was lost amongst the Jews so that the meaning of the Torah was hidden, and it's now being recovered by people like Philo. This was already an idea that had existed in Hellenistic Jewish circles for hundreds of years. And to some extent, there's a selection here that David Winston mentions, where they're discussing whether Moses, in fact, is human, divine, or a blend of both. And this is from his work on Moses, because one of Philo's works is on the life of Moses. And in effect, he is, in other words, Moses becomes for him the highest level of what a human could achieve, to achieving almost semi-divine status because of his knowledge. All right? So that's, that one of the other things, of course, being a Greek Jew, he actually believes that the Septuagint is not just a translation, but a divine inspiration. In other words, the Greek text itself, even though it's translated from the Hebrew, was not a human process, but was a process of revelation. So there's a lot of, Moses is a central figure for Greek-speaking Jews, because they put him up as the perfect lawmaker, better than Solon, who is the great figure of the Greek world. That's something you have to understand. And so that's where we lie. Okay. Everybody okay so far? All right. So now, before I give out the material, I want to ask you a question, because I want to ask you the question before you see the material. What do you think mysticism is? Give me a, as we say, standing on one foot definition to you. When you hear the word mysticism, what does that mean to you?
Communication with God.
Communication with God, okay.
The occult.
The occult, which is kind of the secret arts, right? Anybody have anything else?
Something like belief in the existence of another world or nature or something like that beyond what you see every day.
Belief in the supernatural?
Something like that.
Okay. Anybody else want to suggest anything different? Yes.
It's like it's related to the idea of forms.
You're trying to second guess, Stephen. I'm trying to get you to just without any. Don't try and polish the apple for the teacher. Okay.
So there's so many ways of, God has there's so many concepts of what God is Shekhinah. And
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's not such an easy idea, is it? Yeah, Marianne?
With the abstract meaning of concrete things.
The abstract meaning of concrete things. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. Anybody else? You don't have to if you don't want to contribute. Okay. What I'm going to do is show you two definitions of mysticism. And we're going to look at some characteristics and categories of mysticism. And then we'll look at Philo, because Philo can be considered, I'm sorry, I only made 10 copies. Philo can be considered to be a mystic, and you'll see why. All right? So, if you take a look, David Winston, who is an expert on Philo and is the author of the anthology, the Classics of Western Spirituality anthology on Philo, wrote this. Harvey, do you want to read it?
David, Winston, page 21.
Yes.
It involves a timeless apprehension of the transcendent through a unifying vision that gives bliss or serenity, and normally accrues on the course of self-mastery and contemplation.
So it's an apprehension of the transcendent. You can put the transcendent God, that there's some kind of unifying vision that one receives of God, who is transcendent, and it gives bliss or serenity. We might even go so far as to say ecstasy.
It's like lovemaking.
Well, it's not unusual that many mystical experiences are often talked about in sexual imagery, erotic imagery. And notice, accrues on a course of self-mastery and contemplation. In other words, it just doesn't usually happen to people. There's usually some kind of path that one must follow in order to reach this height. Okay, so let's take a look at a second one, which is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which tries to be
Covers everything.
bigger. It's a huge, if you look it up, it's a huge article, okay? Cal, do you want to read the Stanford Encyclopedia?
A constellation of distinctive practices, discourses, texts, institutions, traditions, and experiences aimed at human transformation, variously defined in different traditions.
Okay, that's pretty vague because it's pretty general. In other words, what's interesting though is the term human transformation. That the article is more about mystical, is the idea that mysticism involves an experience that transforms the person. And it can be practices, there are texts and discussions of it, there are institutions which try to produce this. If you think about contemplative groups, monastic groups, mystical conventicles, they exist. Various traditions, I mean, every religious tradition has some kind of mystical experience that's achieved in particular ways. There are major differences in various traditions, especially between the Western Abrahamic faiths and the Eastern faiths, over what this experience is and, more importantly, how to achieve it. Okay? Yes, Stephen?
Did Spinoza throw this out the window?
No, Spinoza was a mystic in his own way, because you can have, as you will see, a theistic or non-theistic mysticism. All right, so we'll go through this very carefully. So there are essentially, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia, again, I'm following them as a good way to look at it. There are 4 major categories of mystical experience. One is extrovertive, which is the world. You see things in the world which bring about this experience, like looking at a snowflake, contemplating something in the natural world, something that is out there, or the introvertive experience, which is you cut yourself off from the natural world, and it is entirely internal. And by the way, that divide, you see that in the difference between Hindu meditation and Buddhist meditation. Hindu meditation is introvertive, generally, and Buddhist is extrovertive.
Chanting, like chanting?
No, Buddhist meditation tries to submerge you in the totality of all that is. Hindu tries to cut you off from that, from all sense experience. So, and I think in Jewish mysticism you see a little, you can see both. You can see some that are extrovertive and some that are introvertive.
Kabbalists.
Well, Jewish mysticism is not only Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a particular form of Jewish mysticism that arose in the late 12th, early 13th century in southern France, and eventually it became the dominant form of Jewish mysticism to this very day. But it wasn't the only kind, and there were kinds that preceded it. I mean, we can even talk about it in biblical texts. But it, as I said, at the time it arose, there were other forms of mysticism, Jewish mysticism, that existed. They were sometimes interrelated to each other. There were similar texts that were floating around, but definitely it was not the only kind, either historically. It just became the dominant kind by the end of the Middle Ages, I would say. But I will tell you that Maimonides, in his own way, was a mystic through philosophy. And there, he's very similar to Philo. There is a form of philosophic mysticism that has nothing to do with Kabbalah. Yeah.
He said that if you study, and if you are very intelligent and you study also intensely, you come to a higher understanding and a higher realization, and that's mystical.
Yes.
I guess.
If you look at the end of the guide, the last chapters of the guide, what you see there is a form of philosophical mysticism that gets you there through rational discourse. And actually, Philo is very similar in that. We'll get to that. So, category number 2 is theistic and non-theistic. Theistic is you're seeking some kind of union with God, where you and God become one, or you become one with God, or you identify with God, or you are in, and this isn't in the Stanford one, but one that I added from Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, one where you are in communion with God. Communion is different than union. In communion, you maintain your identity and you don't fully blend into God. And Jewish mysticism tends to be communion rather than union, although there are some that reach that.
Yeah, that talk about union?
Yes, very rarely, but it does appear, especially in certain forms of Kabbalism, Hasidic. Some Hasidic mystical experiences are union. Now, there are non-theistic mystical experiences, meaning people who don't believe in God. When you look at the Transcendental School in the United States, they are non-theistic mystics. Emerson, Thoreau, others, they reach a form of nature mysticism that doesn't depend on a belief in God, or at least a conventional God. And here we might, we might bring Spinoza into this, because he didn't believe in a theistic God, a God who is a being, as opposed to being itself. And so there are many forms, I would say many forms of Eastern mysticism are non-theistic. God is not a separate being, but rather being itself. Yes, Paul?
Yeah, but God created nature.
Yeah, but people who aren't theists don't believe that. Like Spinoza, they just believe there is no creation process. There's just, the natural world just exists. There's no being out there that created it. A theistic view, which is a more biblically based one, is that God is a being of some sort who creates a physical universe in some way. Okay.
Yeah, but how can you create something without?
There's no creation. It just is. There's no beginning, no end. It just is. That's the Aristotelian universe. There's no beginning, no God. Well, Aristotle did believe in God, but you don't have to have a God to have a universe. You can just say, the universe is. That's it.
But it doesn't something create it?
No, nothing creates it. It's reality, existence itself, and doesn't require a God. That's the non-theistic view of the world. Okay. Now, C is theurgic or non-theurgic. What this means is, does the mystical experience, does it in effect change the divine or not? Kabbalistic mysticism is primarily theurgic. They believe that we can actually have an impact on the workings of the divine. And theurgy is also another term for magical practice. Theurgic mysticism can blend over into magic. Sometimes the dividing line between magic and mysticism is very fine indeed. And in Kabbalah, you often see on certain levels a complete blending of the two. Okay? So what you have are folk and magical practices that become part of Kabbalistic practice, like the red thread, like there's all kinds of stuff. I don't even have to talk about the modern day. You look into Kabbalistic sources, there's a lot of magical Kabbalistic sources. And people are often fond of dividing Kabbalah into speculative Kabbalah and practical Kabbalah. Speculative Kabbalah being more of a kind of philosophical process, and practical Kabbalah being more close to something you actually do with rituals and things. Not everybody likes to sort of make that distinction and says they're all sort of together, but there certainly are broad trends in Jewish mysticism. One tends to be rather magical, another tends to be more philosophical, and others tend to focus more on ecstatic experiences. Yes?
I'm wondering where prayer, let's say petitionary prayer fits into this. Because
Well-
by prayer, one hopes to affect what God will do.
Yes, and one of the things that is interesting to try and understand is, what is the distinction between mysticism and day-to-day religious experience? It could be only a measure of degree rather than of kind. And the dividing line between petitionary prayer and magic can be a very fine line sometimes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. What we're saying is that, scholars like to make categorizations. The way things actually occur in life are often not so nice and neat. Okay. Number D is apophatic versus cataphatic. I'm trying to remember what that is. Honestly, that one's escaping me for the moment. Okay.
It's all Greek to me.
What?
All Greek to me.
Yeah, it is Greek. I'll look it up. I'm sorry, I blanked on this because you're right. It does come from Greek. All right, but let's take a look now at Philo's mysticism. Really, there are four characteristics that emerge out of Philo's mysticism. Divine transcendence, first of all. The belief that God is totally other and totally not like the physical world. God is absolutely qualityless. That's Winston's word. In other words, and again, you see almost exactly the same kind of things in Maimonides. God doesn't actually have any bodily form, any emotions, nothing that is at all human-like. Therefore, all language about God, according to Maimonides, is completely metaphorical. God doesn't have a hand. So he says, when it talks in the Torah about, God's Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand and the outstretched arm, that for him is a metaphor. It may not have been for the biblical authors, but nonetheless, so God has no qualities in the sense of human qualities. All right?
He's incorporeal.
Well, he's more than incorporeal. He doesn't talk, even to use the word he. You know what I mean? In other words, God has no gender, no emotion, nothing. God, in Aristotelian terms, is thought thinking itself. Again, something that we cannot wrap our minds around because God is so totally other. And Maimonides is very big on this idea that we don't know what God is, and we can't even talk about what God is except in metaphor. What we only can really know is what God is not. That's referred to in philosophical terms as the via negativa, the way of the negative, meaning you can only express what God is not what God actually is, because we don't have divine knowledge. We can only partially apprehend God. Moses was the one who apprehended God greater than any other human being, and he is unique. Yes, Stephen?
What's the metaphoric explanation of God being angry?
Again, God has no emotions. These are all metaphors for the way we understand God.
That's
That
how
we
we
are
perceive
applying, we are applying a positive characteristic to God, which is completely metaphorical. It's a very radical idea in many ways. Okay, so the other thing about God is the first cause or principle. God is the cause of the universe, just as we talked about that if everything has a cause and that cause has a cause, when you go through the chain of causes, you end up with God. God causes and is never caused. So, there's one of these sort of non sequitur questions, that people say, well, if God created the universe, who created God? That's a non sequitur. If you believe God is God, then God is not created. God is there. God is. And that's what first cause is. God is made manifest in the intelligible universe of the Logos, which is God's image, and the sensible universe, which is the image of Logos. In other words, there's a leveling, there's a hierarchy. Out of God comes the Logos. That is the aspect of God, which is semi-independent of God, a being almost unto itself, whereby or through which we can perceive as much of God as we're going to. And the universe, the physical universe, is the physical manifestation of the Logos. So God is 2 steps away from us, so to speak. So that's Philo's notion of God. Secondly, Philo represents what is called rational mysticism, by which through inference and wisdom, one can come to a vision of the divine. Now, he believed that people could have an unmediated, intuitive vision, which is what he meant by faith, which means, but not everybody. In other words, in some ways you have to be prepared for this, so to speak. But he recognizes that sometimes people have a vision, that it doesn't come during a practice, but happens in a moment. But that doesn't happen to everybody. It's someone who's already, so to speak, in the kind of process, even if it doesn't happen intentionally, can have an intuitive vision. Yes?
Maybe it's a Christian concept of the gift of faith. The they speak of the gift of faith, that some people, it's like something that,
They often talk about the grace of God.
yeah, but not everybody can have faith or has it, and those who do see it as a gift. It's something given to them. They haven't done anything.
That, I think, is a little different. I think what they're approaching there is a very an idea that comes out of St. Paul that becomes the centerpiece of Protestant theology, which is justification by faith alone. Namely, that one achieves a state of faith or grace or connection with God, not through rituals or prayers, but through
acts.
divine grace, which is a gift. It's given to you. It's not achieved. And this is one of the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, that the Protestants criticize the Catholics for the idea that somehow you can achieve, and again, it's also salvation, that you can achieve salvation through works, through what we would call mitzvot, rituals, actions, prayers, sacraments. And in pure Protestantism, no, it doesn't happen. That's different than what Philo's talking about. The second idea is that you can achieve this through reason, inferential reason. In other words, you can work your way intellectually up the ladder. And there's a large part of Kabbalah, by the way, that is very similar to this. When you read about the Kabbalistic speculation of the Sphirot, the world of the Sphirot, and those Kabbalistic trees of life and the maps, and when you read the Zohar, which is like reading, again, it's like Philo seeing the text as not just the text, but a code for something deeper. The Zohar is an attempt to decode the text of the Torah, but the Zohar is not the only text of Kabbalah, and it's not really the first text, it just happens to be the one that became the Major's text. But in effect, this is a way of sort of working your way intellectually up the ladder of creation until you reach this tremendous intellectual or inferential state of understanding. So you can achieve this state through that process. And this is done through Torah. And Torah is Chokhmah, which is the ultimate of philosophical achievement. You just have to dig in and understand it. And remember, a large part of Philo is just doing that. And some of the works that Philo wrote were not meant for the masses or for Gentiles, but were meant for people like him. Okay, the third one, and this one I do know what it means, is apatheia versus eupotheia. And apatheia are practices that take you away from your normal emotional states. That's where we get the word apathetic from. It's not apathetic in the English sense, but it is the way of doing certain practices, ascetic practices, to get you away from everyday emotions and feelings, and rather into a state where you don't have those things. In other words, it's taking you away from the world. That doesn't mean that the body is necessarily totally forgotten. There's a discussion in Philo and in other philosophers over the role of drinking wine and even getting drunk.
How about fasting?
Yes, fasting is part of it. But it's not that Philo is denying the body, but he is limiting the body. Remember, we saw this. He wants to limit the body's influence, the hedonistic, the pleasure, so that you don't go overboard on it. So to achieve a state of apatheia is to do that. And if you, in other words, and if you don't, then you end up with eupatheia. That's the opposite. And you can't achieve this connection with God without practicing apatheia, which is, again, the suppression or redirection of one's emotional state away from everyday kind of approach. Lastly, he actually talks about mystical experience. And here he says that the knowledge of God is a person's supreme bliss. And this is where he's very similar to Maimonides. What you achieve at the end of this, the knowledge of God, the apprehension as much as you can, being a human, of God. The soul's intense yearning for the divine. the recognition of the nothingness of humanity and the need to go out of oneself, the attachment to God, the realization that it is God alone who acts. There's a preference for contemplative prayer. There's a concept of timeless union with the all, and Philo leans towards the notion of union rather than communion. The suddenness with which the vision appears. It happens. You cannot predict when it's going to occur. He talks about something called sober intoxication. Namely, you have not had any alcohol, and yet it is like you are intoxicated. The ecstatic condition of the soul in the mystic state. There's a form of ecstasy. And the flow, the ebb and flow of mystical experience is it doesn't happen. It comes, it goes. You do not stay in that state all the time.
Just seems totally contradictory on the surface at least. God is absolutely qualityless,
Yes.
yet the knowledge of God is a person's supreme bliss.
Yes, the knowledge of God is the best you're going to get. In other words, how high can a human get in an understanding of God is but you're never going to know God perfectly. Okay? Because God is God and we're us. Right? As somebody, I don't know where this saying comes from, if I knew God, I would be God. Okay? And there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of similarities to Maimonides if you read the last chapters of the guide. That's what Maimonides is heading towards, and that's why he was a mystic. Maybe not as ecstatic a mystic as Philo's concept of mysticism. Maybe it's more of a quiet kind of experience. But one of the most famous representations of the ecstatic mystical experiences is this famous Bernini statue of Saint Teresa that's in Rome. Have you ever seen pictures of it? She is like this, and there's an angel throwing a golden arrow into her. It's erotic, but that's Bernini caught what ecstatic mysticism can be in a statue as much as anybody could in a work of art.
I think St. Teresa was born Jewish.
She was of Converso heritage. I don't think she was born Jewish, but I think she was of Converso heritage. Okay, so in the time remaining, let's look at a few texts which Philo does not have a single text devoted to this. It's scattered throughout his writing. So we're going to look first of all at his work of the questions and answers in Genesis. The text I have says number 4. That's weird. Okay, let's check this out. Maybe I misprinted this. 4. Let me double check. Excuse me for a minute. It does say 4:4. That doesn't make any sense. But there is something great that Abraham... Let me just make sure I got the right reference with these Latin things. QGs. Yeah, that's what it's supposed to be. All right, you know what? I'll ferret it out in our edition when I put it up in the lecture. So instead, Cal, do you want to read this first one? It's called "The Limit of Happiness is the Presence of God." I'll see if I can find it while you're reading.
The limit of happiness is the presence of God. But it is something great that Abraham asks, namely, that God shall not pass by, nor remove to a distance, and leave his soul desolate and empty. Genesis 18:3. For the limit of happiness is the presence of God, which completely fills the whole soul with his whole incorporeal and eternal light. and the limit of misery is his passing on the way. For immediately thereafter comes heavy and profound darkness, which possesses the soul. Wherefore also the fratricide Cain says, "Great is the guilt of my punishment that you leave me," Genesis 4:13, indicating that there is no greater punishment for the soul than to be abandoned by God. Moreover, in another place Moses says, "Lest the Lord be removed from them," showing that for the soul to be separated from the contemplated of the existent one is the most complete of evils. For these reasons, he attempts to lead the people toward God. Not any man, for this is not possible, but God-loving souls that can be led, when a heavenly love and desire have come on them and seized them.
So, what is he saying there? What is he saying there? That every soul desires to be in immediate contact with God, right?
That there's some that do not.
Yes, some that do not. Not everybody gets it, but because of their circumstances, or because they have not sought this, or they're living in the wrong kind of way, or they have the wrong kind of ideas, the fact is that not everybody gets it. But the soul ultimately desires this. And the idea is that he says there's no greater punishment for the soul than to be abandoned by God. But those who are God-loving souls that can be led when a heavenly love and desire have come on them and seized them. Most people will not be seized by this. It's like falling in love. Okay? And that's what the ultimate happiness of the soul is. The ultimate happiness of the soul is to come into this communion with God. And when it ceases, it's like a feeling of abandonment, of a broken heart. This is very, it shows you his own his understanding of his own experience of what it feels like when one comes into this state and when one leaves it. Anybody have any questions or reactions to this?
It smacks of the evangelical.
What?
It smacks of the evangelical.
Well, why do you say that, and what do you mean?
Well, my experience is really superficial, but when they worship, they become very emotional, act out.
Yes.
Kind of ecstatic, you're saying.
That's the word, yes.
Ecstatic.
Yeah.
Not all evangelicals do that, by the way, but you're right. There is especially in Pentecostal Christianity, the ecstatic experience is central to their worship, which they try to use various forms of practices, public practices, which will lead people to that ecstatic experience. And that is done in many religious traditions. I can even show you in the Bible, bands of prophets used music and dance to achieve an ecstatic, prophetic state. Very similar. They use music. I don't think they use dance, but they certainly use music and prayer. And don't forget, they're going in there with a predilection for this. And the fact is that if it's happening in a group, it's more likely to happen to people in a group than practicing individually. But that's not what Philo is talking about. He's not talking about a band of ecstatics. He's talking about an individual through their own prayer and contemplation, achieving this state, which for him, I think is less out there and ecstatic and more what is called quietistic, internal. I'm pretty sure, although when he talks about the therapeutai, this band of Jewish monastics, they they do stuff with music and dance. I'm not sure they're getting into ecstatic experiences, but one could see that one could maybe interpret it that way. Yeah, Stephen.
My bliss in relation to God increases with the recognition of how little I know, not with knowing more.
Well, that's the via negativa. The understanding of one's not understanding is, perhaps one of the ways, exactly, the idea of, but nonetheless, Maimonides would tell you need to strip away your illusions. At one point, Maimonides
Doesn't know anything.
Maimonides has a discourse on the meaning of sacrifice and why God decided to ask the Israelites to sacrifice. And in this, he reveals the fact that prayer is superior to sacrifice, and the most superior form of worship is wordless contemplation. But that's not possible for most people. So people require language to talk about God, even when the language itself is completely metaphorical and doesn't actually describe God. This is Maimonides' idea, that you need to have prayer services, as most people are not going to sit in wordless contemplation.
Yeah. How can you express what you're feeling without words?
Well, the Quakers do it. In other words, the Quakers actually, some form of Quakerism, that's what they do. They are the most radical in terms of, they make a ritual of not having rituals, right? They are the most radical form of Western Christianity in eschewing any form of ritual or word. And they were, of course, firmly embedded as Christians, but many Quakers today do not even identify themselves as Christians. Yes?
I've been to many, many Quaker services, and I found it extremely spiritual.
Yes.
By just sitting there with the people.
Yes.
More moving than most services I've been to.
They're really serious about this. And it's for most of us, the notion of silence is uncomfortable. Really, to sit in silence. I had one of the very early, it was actually the first retreat that I ran with a meditation leader, Kurt Holting from Seattle, many years ago, that was sort of the tryout for a later program that I developed with Green Faith called the Fellowship Program. We did a lot of it in silence. Our meals, contemplation. It matched what we had done on a wilderness kayaking trip in Alaska for Jewish environmentalists. There was a lot of silence that was employed. Well, we had somebody who came to this retreat who left because she could not stand the silence. She said, "This is not Jewish. We have to talk, we have to discuss." She couldn't handle the silence. Fine, but that's part of what mystical contemplation, rather than ecstatic kind of experiences, are based on the notion of silent contemplation. For some reason, they don't have the next text in here either. I will make sure that when I put this up online, we have the sources. This one is called Make Your Soul a Shrine of God. And this is from his work called Questions and Answers on Exodus, which I have no idea why it's not in our translation. Mary Ann, do you want to read this? This is starting right there.
For the Savior is beneficent and kind, and he wishes to accept the rational race from all living creatures. He therefore honors them with an even ampler gift, a great benefaction in which all kinds of good things are found, and he graciously grants his appearance, if only there be a suitable place, purified with holiness and every kind of purity. For if, O mind, you do not prepare yourself of yourself, excising desires, pleasures, griefs, fears, follies, injustices, and related evils, and do not change and adapt yourself to the vision of holiness, you will end your life in blindness, unable to see the intelligible sum. If, however, you are worthily initiated and should be consecrated to God, and in a certain sense become an animate shrine of the Father, then instead of having closed eyes, you will see the first cause, and in wakefulness you will cease from the deep sleep in which you have been held. Then will appear to you that manifest one who causes incorporeal rays to shine for you, and grants visions of the unambiguous and indescribable things of nature, and the abundant sources of other good things. For the beginning and end of happiness is to be able to see God, but this cannot happen to him who has not made his soul, as I said before, a sanctuary, and altogether a shrine of God.
Now, this is from a fragmentary work where he is talking about various things in the book of Exodus. So what's one of the biggest parts of the book of Exodus? The description of the tabernacle. So he is, in effect, describing the tabernacle as an allegory for how you should prepare yourself to receive the presence of God. Because just as the physical tabernacle was created very particularly with very special materials, with zones of holiness that were forbidden for certain kinds of impurities that were forbidden to come within the compound. And when it was all prepared, the presence of God in the last chapter of Exodus, in a form of a cloud, comes down into the Holy of Holies. So he's saying, again, he would not deny that this is not a physical description, but he also sees this as a lesson, an allegorical lesson for us to turn ourselves into a shrine, excising desires, pleasures, griefs, fears, follies, injustices, and related evils. And that is that for him is the apatheia. That's the process of apatheia, excising all of that from you. You then turn yourself into this holy shrine, which can receive the presence of God. And the second way he refers to it, as if you are blind and now you see, or you were asleep and now you wake up. So if you expect to do this, this is the process by which you must act. So it just doesn't happen out of the blue.
But if you see God, isn't that a joyful experience?
Ultimately, it is a joyful experience, but it is a happiness that is not a hedonistic, emotional happiness. This is where we have a lot of trouble understanding what he means by happiness, because for us, happiness is an emotional experience where, in fact, for him, it's a deeper and more complex idea. It's closer to what Jefferson talked about when he said the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't mean an emotional state, it means well-being. But for him, it goes even deeper than that. It is that sense of joy that is not like normal emotional joy. It's a mystical experience. Okay. Now we can actually get to one that's in the book. So if you look at the work on dreams, number 1, paragraph 60, which is found on page 370. Okay. Let's keep taking turns of the number of these men. Do you have it? Numbers. Page 370.
Yes.
Number 60.
Okay.
Actually, you know what? Start with number 59.
Such then are those men who reconnoiter the
porters of wisdom for us, but those who are actually her athletes and who practice her exercises are more perfect. For these men think fit to learn with complete accuracy the whole question connected with the external senses, and after having done so, then to proceed to another and more important speculation, leaving all consideration of the wholes of the body, which they call
Haran. Now, so here he is seeing the story of Abraham leaving Haran as the soul now moving away from the normal kind of thing. But notice he talks about how men who begin to develop wisdom as someone who reconnoiter it, and he speaks of them as athletes. He's using the metaphor of an athlete who has to go into training. But there are those who kind of reconnoiter it, but they never leave Haran. They don't actually get there. So read on. Of the number of these men.
Of the number of these men is Abraham, who attained to great progress and improvement in the comprehension of complete knowledge, for when he knew most, then he most completely renounced himself, in order to attain to the accurate knowledge of him who was the truly living God. And indeed, this is a very natural course of events, for he who completely understands himself does also very much, because of his thorough appreciation of it, renounce the universal nothingness of the creature, and he who renounces himself learns to comprehend the living God.
So Abraham, in leaving Haran, is the living metaphor for leaving behind the normal concerns and getting on the process of really learning God by renouncing, the day-to-day desires, fears, emotions, and cultivating that which will bring you to where you need to go. So he's using his philosophical exegesis here to tell us about how do you achieve this mystical state. And he uses multiple metaphors, athletes, and so on and so forth. Let's take a look at another text.
He doesn't want you to sort of enter a monastery and just
No.
contemplate. He wants you to be part of this world, but to renounce certain things in order to get there.
Well, yes, I think you're right. And do you remember the autobiographical sections we talked about? How much he desired so much to stop having to get involved in public affairs, and how he would seek to sort of be by himself.
Right.
But even sometimes while he was in the middle of a crowd, he could have one of these experiences. So you're right, he's not living in a monastery, but he's visited one. In other words, when you read his book, his treatise on the Therapeutae, who are a Jewish monastic group, co-ed by the way, who live outside of Alexandria, it's pretty obvious he's been there. It's not a second, who knows how long he was there for. That's one of the things we just don't know about him. Did he go to the Therapeutae? Did he live with them for a while? Was he part of them for a while? Did he just visit them? But think about, again, he is part of this incredibly prominent family, which was so actively involved in public affairs. Maybe for somebody like him, it would have been impossible to completely retreat from the world. We just don't know. But he was there. And he describes these people who are exactly retreating from the world, so that they spend most of their day by themselves, in isolation, studying Torah, and they get together for meals, not even all meals, but for prayer on Shabbat, and on Saturday night they have what we would call a Malava Malka. But what's fascinating is it's both men and women, but they're celibate. It's a celibate community. They're very similar to the Essenes, except for the fact that they have both men and women involved in it. So, did he do this or not? Evidently, for most of his life, he probably did not. All right, so now let's look at another section from Dreams. number 232. No, it's found on page 404 at the bottom. He talks about he's talking again. What's interesting is if you know what it is, we'll start in 231, and we'll look at 231 and 232. Stephen, do you want to start there? It's the second last paragraph on page 404, and there is something.
And there is something which closely resembles this in the passage of Scripture concerning the high priest. For when, says the Scripture, he goes into the Holy of Holies, he will not be a man till he has gone out again. But if at that time he is not a man, it is clear that he is not God either, but a minister of God, belonging to his mortal nature to creation, but as to his immortal nature to the uncreated God. And he is placed in the middle class until he again goes forth among the things which belong to the body and to the flesh.
All right, what is he talking about here? Leviticus 16 is the description of the Yom Kippur ritual and the high priest going into the Holy of Holies. So for him, not only is this a description of what actually happened in the temple, and by the way, what actually happens in the temple, because Philo lived during the time in which the temple existed, and he even went once on pilgrimage to Jerusalem in his life, if you remember. But for him, he sees the entrance and the exit of the high priest into the Holy of Holies as part of an allegory for the mystical process. That when he's in the Holy of Holies, he is not God, but a minister of God. He's come as close as possible, but then he goes out again, and he then becomes part of what he calls the middle class. Doesn't mean economically, but spiritually, where he is now back into the world of the body and the flesh. Read on. And this is the order of things.
And this is the order of things according to nature. When the mind, being entirely occupied with divine love, bends its course towards the temple of God and approaches it with all possible earnestness and zeal, it becomes inspired and forgets all other things and forgets itself also. It remembers him alone and depends on him alone, who is attended by it as by a bodyguard, and who receives its ministrations, to whom it consecrates and offers up the sacred and untainted virtues.
So when the soul is in this state, it forgets everything else. And notice he says, and forgets itself too. What does that mean? It forgets itself too?
It's in union with God.
Yes, exactly. The self, the ego, disappears. It's what some Eastern mysticism talk about, or even Kabbalah, especially in, I think, Hasidic ideas of a kind of annihilation of the soul. In other words, you no longer exist. There is a description of it in a Jewish mystical text, I forget which one, that in effect, when you are in this state, and some Kabbalistic texts believe you can actually remain in this state, or that the highest level of mystical attainment are those extremely few people, those spiritual masters, who can remain in this state at all times. And what they are, they're walking around and they look like a body, but in effect, they have been scooped out. They are an empty vessel filled with the light of God. There is no there. There is only God within. The self has disappeared. There's a
third party recognize that?
Possibly. There is a work by an Italian Kabbalist from the 18th century called the Misilat Yesharim, which means the way of the just, the way of the righteous. And this is pre-Hasidic. This was written before the Hasidic movement, so it's early 18th century. You can get it in there's two different translations available. Mordechai Kaplan did one many years ago that has been actually reprinted, and there's a new edition that came out about 5 years ago where Kaplan's translation is reprinted, but there's a modern commentary by Rabbi Ira Stone of Philadelphia. Rabbi Stone is an expert on the Musar movement of the 19th century, which is a spiritual movement that occurred in the Lithuanian yeshivas. It's not Hasidic, but Ira, who I've known for many years, wrote this commentary on on Kaplan's translation of the Misilat Yesharim, referring back to the Hebrew. It's a very fine edition. But I studied the Misilat Yesharim when I was in rabbinical school, and Luzzatto, who, again, he's an Italian Kabbalist, he believes that there are three classes of people. There is what he calls the tzaddikim, the common righteous, and then further up the spiritual ladder, because the book is written as a spiritual ladder based on a text, a midrash from the Talmud, that you achieve certain things, you move up this spiritual ladder, and when you're so many steps up, you are a tzaddik. Again, it shows you it's not at all like the Hasidic terminology. When you go to a higher level of spiritual attainment, you are a Hasid. The highest level of achievement, which is by the extremely few, the spiritual masters, are the Ish HaKadosh, the holy man. And he has a very little bit at the end on that, where he suggests something like that state, but also that this person is so holy, so different, that he can actually achieve what we would call miracles. He can receive prophetic inspiration, and he's not talking about the past, and he can bring the dead back to life. So it's a fascinating book, and it was widely read. And the reason why Rabbi Stone did it was because it was widely read in the Musar movement in the 19th century. It was one of their primary spiritual texts. And from a modern perspective, it's very ascetic in terms of what you're supposed to practice. But the ultimate, the very few, are in this state all the time. Now, Philo doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that it's possible for somebody to be in that state in a constant way. But he is talking about the annihilation of the self here. It forgets all other things, it forgets himself. We didn't read the whole thing yet, so keep reading. It remembers him alone. Did we read that part?
I think we're at 233.
Okay, so read 233. But when the inspiration
has ceased and the excessive desire has relaxed, then it returns from divine things and becomes a man again, mixing with human affairs which were awaiting him in the vestibule, that they might carry him off while gazing only on the things in them.
And he could be describing himself. But the high priest exits the temple and goes back to the day-to-day state. And that's exactly what he feels the mystical experience is like. But you could hear echoes of his own experience here. While you are there, there is an annihilation of self. But it doesn't remain permanently. You have to go back in the world. Okay, let's look at another one. This is from a work called Concerning Noah's Work as a Planter. And we're going to go to number 23, which is on page 193. 193, number 23. And again, this is one of these commentaries on Genesis, what happens, Noah plants a vineyard, and then the next treatise is on on drunkenness. But anyway, Suzanne, you want to pick it up? Number 23.
Number
Again,
23.
we're on page 193 on the left side. On this account,
On this account, those persons who are insatiable in their desire for wisdom and knowledge are said in the sacred oracles to be called up. For it is legitimate that those persons should be called up to the deity who have been inspired by him. For it would be a terrible thing if whirlwinds and hurricanes have power to tear trees up by their roots and to toss them in the air, and to carry off vessels of many tons burden, though loaded with cargoes, as if they were the lightest things imaginable, out of the middle of the sea. And if even lakes and rivers are raised on high, when their streams actually leave the bosom of the earth, having been drawn up by the ardent and diversified eddies of the winds, and yet, if the mind, which is intrinsically light, cannot be raised up by the nature of the divine Spirit, which is able to do everything and to subdue all things below, and cannot be elevated to an exceeding height, and especially the mind of the man who studies philosophy in a genuine manner.
keep reading number 25.
For he does not incline downwards to the things dear to the body and to the earth, from which he separates himself, and studies to alienate himself as far as possible, but he is borne upwards, being insatiably devoted to sublime, holy, magnificent, and happy natures.
We can stop there. So for him, when God calls Moses up on the mountain, this is an allegory for those few whose soul is called up to God. And I love his analogy, right? You can have tornadoes ripping things up, bringing water into the air, ships being flown away. He says, then why cannot the mind or the soul, which is intrinsically light, be not raised up by the divine mind or soul? So, and notice, he has to study, he separates himself and studies to alienate himself as far as possible from the normal day-to-day affairs, and therefore he is born up. And that notion of being born up, that the soul ascends, not only fits with the cosmology of the day, but is a very typical, it's what we call the vertical metaphor. God is up. I mean, whatever. God is above the earth. What's interesting is that there's not only the vertical metaphor in many mystical traditions, there's also the metaphor of the well, that you go deep down inside. So the Jewish metaphors tend to be the vertical metaphor, but there are some Kabbalistic texts which do the more of the deep down inside oneself.
God is right here.
Well, again, the vertical metaphor is based on an entirely different view of the universe. The notion that heaven is not a physical place or is somehow not above the physical sphere, I don't know exactly. I have asked people, and I've tried to find an answer to that. When did people start thinking that heaven was no longer a physical locale? And I can't give you an answer to that. I am guessing that it was in the 18th century, but I'm not 100% sure, and I haven't found somebody who can give me an adequate answer to that. When was heaven spiritualized? I actually looked online once, and what I found were a number of evangelical sites where they were contemplating the problem of the literal text of the Bible, which suggests that God is up there as a physical space, as opposed to the notion of, well, we've been up in space and we haven't seen heaven, and is it a spiritual place? Where there are people who actually have been struggling with the literal text of the Bible versus what we know about the physical universe and the notion of heaven as a spiritual locale as opposed to an actual physical locale. But I don't know when that for the vast majority of, say, Western tradition, my guess is it happened in the 18th century. I don't have an actual answer to that. Yeah.
Because it happened to me personally, when as a child, as a young child, I certainly believed that God was up there.
Yes.
And then I discovered science fiction.
Okay, so there are some other, I gave us more text than possible, so, look at the other text, but you get the idea of what is going on with him. And he's not talking about this in the abstract. You can see his language of these experiences are extremely rich. We know from some of the texts we looked at that are autobiographical, he achieved this state. He's not talking about something that has not happened to him. So he definitely, at the core of his spiritual practice, Philo was a mystic. He achieved some kind of a philosophical, mystical attachment to God. Again, he doesn't discuss this in a separate treatise. You have to go through his work and pick it out, and scholars are not 100% in agreement over exactly what happened to him or what he's talking about. There are times he's ambiguous, sometimes he's, as by the way, many mystics are, rather ambiguous because they understand the limitation of language to be able to describe their experiences. Sometimes mystics talk a lot because they utilize language to describe something they cannot describe, and other times they talk very little because they cannot use language to discuss what they're talking. There are two tendencies. What's fascinating in the Jewish tradition is that we don't actually have very many first-hand accounts of this experience. Jewish mystics, and this includes Kabbalists of all sorts, are extremely reticent to actually describe personal experiences. They exist, but relative to the bulk of Jewish mystical writing from the Bible, onward, there's actually a rather small number of sources which talk directly about one's personal spiritual experience. The late Rabbi Louis Jacobs of England actually wrote an anthology of Jewish mystical experiences. I think it's still in print. I have a hardcover of the first edition, but
Is it a slim volume?
it's a slim. It's not a big volume, no. But he starts with Ezekiel, and he goes through, and he there's a little bit of an introduction to each one. So I think this collection was done 30 years ago or something, maybe more. He collects what he feels to be examples from the entire range of Jewish history of personal accounts of this. And relatively speaking, there aren't as many as one would expect.
Who's that?
Rabbi Louis Jacobs. He died some years ago. I think he was one of the great scholars in the Jewish community. He was an English rabbi. The man's knowledge was vast. He wrote works on Jewish theology, which are some of the best ever written because his language was extremely clear. He wrote books on Talmudic texts. He was an expert on Talmud, and he was an expert on Jewish mysticism and spirituality. There's in fact a website created by his disciples to preserve his wisdom, in which you can get regular, emails about stuff that's been posted, and they have a lot of selections of articles and pieces from his various works. He wrote a book which was an overall discussion of Jewish theology called A Jewish Theology, published I think in the 60s or 70s, I don't remember what, and although it's a little out of date, it is still one of the greatest introductions to Jewish theology I have read, and I still look at it. In other words, for clarity and completeness, the only other person whose writing I hold as high as Louis Jacobs is my teacher, Rabbi Neil Gilman, who also writes with great clarity. So I recommend Louis Jacobs. Okay, I want to just sum up now, and I hope you enjoyed this class, to introduce you to someone who most Jews don't even know exist and have never studied, and as you can see, there's a vast corpus of his material. Philo of Alexandria, like Maimonides, represented the sort of the peak of the civilization in which he lived. He was not the first, and he was certainly not the last Jewish philosopher of Alexandria, but merely from the survival of his work, he was the greatest. He came from an incredibly prominent and influential family. He was actively involved in the most important events in Jewish history in his day. The embassy to Gaius Caligula, the whole problem of the temple. He was a proud, observant Jew. Whatever he observed, we know. He wasn't, again, we can't say that he did what the rabbinic Jews later did, but we know that he was a very proud and loyal Jew, and he nonetheless was, like many Jewish philosophers after him, he attempted to synthesize the prevalent philosophical traditions with the Judaism of his day, specifically with the Tanakh, because he felt that the two represented the two sides of the same wisdom. Essentially, he did this partly for Gentile audiences, as a kind of way of saying Judaism is sophisticated, is just as good as any, even better than Greek philosophy. Partly he did it for people like himself, who might have studied philosophy and then said, well, what do I need Judaism for? Which is exactly why Maimonides wrote the Guide of the Perplexed. If I have philosophy, I don't need Torah. So he writes this for those Jews as well, and also to educate his own community in the meaning of Torah. So he was a great teacher in that regard. One of the great tragedies of Jewish history is that when his community was destroyed, some 60 years or so after he died, his work disappeared to the Jewish world. That civilization was wiped out. And as a result, his work did not survive as a body of work that Jews studied actively. It was preserved by the Christian world. And it was preserved for two reasons. One, because first they thought he was Christian. As I mentioned, there's a kind of Christian midrash that Philo was really a Christian, or I think he met St. Paul or something and became a Christian. I don't know. But also that he was the way in which many early church fathers learned Plato. In other words, they used his method of melding the Bible and philosophy to do the same thing, not only with the Hebrew Scriptures, but with the New Testament. So he became an important influence on the Christian world, and since the Christian philosophical tradition then influenced the Islamic philosophical tradition, when Islam arose in the 7th century, and he indirectly influenced the medieval Jewish philosophical tradition because the Jews learned philosophy from the Muslims, in the 8th or in the 9th and 10th centuries. And so indirectly, as an undercurrent, Philo's method of blending scripture and philosophy using metaphor and using allegory, indirectly influenced the Jewish philosophical tradition. So Maimonides never read Philo, didn't know of his existence. And yet if you read the guide and you read some of the text, you will see a lot of similarities in method. If not, if Philo is primarily a Platonist, Maimonides is primarily an Aristotelian, but nonetheless, there's a very similar process in mind. So when did Jews finally rediscover Philo? In the Renaissance. In the 15th century, a Jewish scholar, an Italian Jewish scholar, this was when Jews began reading Greek texts, and they rediscovered Philo and Josephus and other ancient texts of the Second Temple period that had been lost to the general Jewish tradition for the most part. But he really, he was rediscovered, but not that widely read.
Were they preserved in monasteries as so much was?
Well, they were preserved with the writings of the church fathers. And that's why some of the material is fragmentary, because it only exists in quotes in Christian works. So a Christian writer like Eusebius or others will quote Philo, and sometimes these are extensive quotes, and that's all we have from a particular work. By the way, that's true of other ancient Jewish writing from the Second Temple, like the tragedian Jewish playwright named Ezekiel of Alexandria, who wrote a Jewish play using Greek dramatic models on the Exodus. The only parts we have of it are quoted in Eusebius. So we know it exists. We have, we've got a big chunk of it, but we don't have the whole thing. So that's how Philo is preserved. I think that for us today, I think it's important to not forget that civilization, to study that civilization. I think it still has a lot to tell us about how do you remain a proud, loyal Jew and yet become thoroughly acculturated to the civilization you live in. Because that's what's going on here in America. That's the struggle of Jewish identity in America. How do we remain Jewish and yet be part of this civilization that we live in? And German Jewry had to do the same thing. Unfortunately, like Alexandrian Jewry, it was cut off by its destruction by the Nazis. But the same thing happened in Germany in the 19th and 20th century. The question is still an open question. I think in American Jewry, I think you see the emergence of a genuine American Jewish civilization, but we have now, and I don't use this in a critical sense, but in a technical sense, the complicating factor of an independent Jewish state, the State of Israel, which none of these other civilizations had to deal with in the same way. The other one, that, of course, that is the great civilization that produced Maimonides, the Spanish Jewish civilization, which was this incredible integration of Judaism and the Islamic world. Anybody have any final questions or comments for us?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going
Thank you very much.
to turn